will be looking at today are how are Appalachian communities responding to disasters while recovering. And as I mentioned, our three partners, we're so grateful to have them here: West Virginia Rivers, Appalachian Voices, and the Kentucky Flood Resilience Coalition. I just wanted to introduce the three panelists that you'll hear from today. Starting with Kentucky, we have Brendan Muckian-Bates, who is a policy and advocacy associate with the Appalachian Citizens Law Center. His work at ACLC includes federal policy, advocacy, and research on coal miners' health and safety issues, as well as climate disasters and flooding across the Appalachian region. He helps to convene the Kentucky Flood Resilience Coalition and is a steering committee member with the Appalachian Flood Resilience Coalition. He is also currently serving as a board member with the Ohio Valley Environmental Advocates and the West Virginia Labor History Association. Thank you for joining us, Brendan. From West Virginia, we have Carrie Decker, who is a nonprofit professional with over 2 decades of experience in management, operations, marketing, and communications. Carrie comes with a passion for rural communities and climate and energy justice, especially how it relates to resilience. Carrie has also worked to advocate on behalf and alongside many organizations and individuals in the Mountain State. Carrie enjoys making connections and thriving relationships with communities to help amplify diverse voices. With both lived experience in failing water systems and unreliable water hauling, Carrie knows clean water is a basic human right. So she brings both her professional and her personal experience to her work. Her tenure working with small business, tourism, economic development in the state has led her to advocate for clean rivers and free access to them. She's a graduate of the 2024 Leadership West Virginia cohort. She earned her master's degree in public administration with a concentration in nonprofit management from Penn State University. Welcome, Carrie. Thanks for joining us. And from North Carolina, we have Kristin Stroup, who serves as a senior program manager for energy and climate resilience at Appalachian Voices, where she focuses on designing programs, tools, and resources that increase access to renewable energy and empower residents and communities to understand their climate risks and to take steps to reduce them. A North Carolina native, Kristin brings over 20 years of experience, both designing and implementing clean energy, climate adaptation and resilience, and economic development programs and projects both in the U.S. and overseas. She has been deeply involved in both relief, recovery, and long-term resilience efforts following Hurricane Helene, including serving as a member of the Black Mountain Community Emergency Response Team, the first such North Carolina team west of Winston-Salem. She holds an MA in International Development from the University of Denver and a bachelor's in anthropology from Goddard College. Welcome, Kristin. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Johanna Lawton, who is the Deputy Director at Rebuild by Design. So Rebuild by Design got its start in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. And what we were seeing here was this question coming up, both at the federal, the state, and the local level of what do we do to build back better? How do we ensure that communities are prepared for the next disaster? Now, more than a decade later, we've been working with partners on the ground who are continuing to ask the same question. How are disasters both impacting communities? What infrastructure is in place to help protect communities from storms they're recovering from and storms that will come, disasters that will come, and what funding mechanisms can help to alleviate the suffering that we're seeing happening across all of the U.S. Rebuild by Design works in 3 unique ways. We work with partners, local communities, experts, and government leaders through large-scale regional design competitions, as I mentioned, innovative processes to address the unique challenges that cities are facing, all the way from New York to the Bay Area, and of course, the Appalachian region. And our third pillar is research and policy. So I wanted to share a little bit about what's happening across the U.S. Our Atlas of Accountability is a U.S. mapping of county-level disaster declarations from 2011 to 2024. It also has a congressional overlay which shows which counties are represented by elected officials. So here, what we're seeing in the darker red, that's a higher disaster account. But what we're seeing across the US is that these aren't unique to certain states or certain counties. We're all being impacted. But when you look within the Appalachian region and you see Kentucky, you see it's heavily saturated with the darker red, also West Virginia and North Carolina, the three states that we'll be focusing on today. Also, we've been seeing it just in the last couple months in the media how Appalachia disaster impacts are affecting these three states, from economic impacts to loss of life, which is quite devastating and has been occurring for quite some time now. So now I want to zoom us in a bit and orient us within the Appalachian region. And there are 423 counties across 13 states within the Appalachian region. The three that we're focusing on today, the counties within Kentucky, West Virginia, and North Carolina. But what you can see from this map is that disasters are saturated across the Appalachian region also. So it will be interesting to hear from our panelists about the insights that they might have from neighboring states or neighboring counties that have been impacted recently by disasters, and if there's any collaboration or coordination happening across the region. So without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Brendan Muckian-Bates, who will share some insights on Kentucky, followed by Kristin Stroup from North Carolina and Carrie Decker from West Virginia. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Olive. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Brendan. I'm a policy advocate with the Appalachian Citizens Law Center, and we'll be talking today about some of the work we've been doing in Kentucky over the past few years, in a few of our different coalition spaces. So the first big thing to kind of keep in mind, to what Olive was just mentioning and on that slide there, um, is some of Kentucky's sort of unique climate risks. Um, there we go. Um, as you saw in the map that Olive had up as well, Kentucky has faced significant federally declared climate disasters in the past decade and a half. And particularly in recent years, we're seeing more and more of these events taking place. But whereas my work is, sometimes more directly located in the eastern region of Kentucky and the Appalachian region, the state's disaster risk is not necessarily tied to just one region or another. It's just the degree to risk that those regions face. So in eastern Kentucky, those of you who are familiar with Appalachia's geography, East Kentucky has very steep terrain, very narrow valleys that creates a lot of the severe flash flood risks. And whenever you see some of the more recent flooding disasters that have happened like in July 2022, February 2025, or more recent flooding events, those very severe flooding events can take place very quickly, channeling into very small rural communities. Western and central Kentucky are a little bit different. There's more issues with riverine flooding. There's more tornadoes and severe storms out west, as well as increasing periods of heat. So, the geography of the Appalachian region itself does make flooding particularly dangerous. Like I mentioned, water can move very rapidly through very steep watersheds that is then funneled into a lot of the low-lying communities where there's already been limited buildable land. And over generations, that's where communities have tended to crop up, is on that sort of lower lying buildable land. So homes, roads, schools, health care clinics, hospitals, businesses, utilities, you name it. Um, those tend to be sort of concentrated along streams and valley floors, places that are more at risk of flooding. And so what that means is a lot of times there are repeat flood communities that experience very extreme types of disasters year after year after year. And recovery is not like just a single sort of temporary phase. It has to become part of this ongoing condition that a lot of households and local governments face. And because these events are also affecting parts of the Commonwealth where there are disproportionately higher numbers of lower income households, greater cost burdens for certain things like flood insurance and so on, it makes it very challenging for households in the Appalachian region of Kentucky to recover while you're sort of constantly in this process of mucking out your homes and trying to recover and rebuild and on and on. So the question here is really like, it's not simply whether Kentucky can recover, but it's whether its recovery system actually allows the communities there to recover equitably. So on the next slide, there's I want to talk a little bit about some of the not really so equitable forms of recovery that we've noticed in Kentucky. The first is on flood insurance. Um, so I've been working on a report that looks at the National Flood Insurance Program and the number of policies in force kind of across the Central Appalachian region and looking at whether increased flooding disasters is going to lead to more policies for flood insurance because people are more aware that this is a growing climate disaster, climate risk for their region. And then looking at median household income levels and whether FEMA's new risk rating system that's meant to make flood insurance more accurate is going to price out a lot of those homes. And what we're finding is, particularly in Kentucky, repeat flood exposure does not lead to an increase in flood insurance policies. Rates are going to continue to go up. The risks are significantly higher. I think Kentucky is expected to have like almost 200% increase in flood insurance premiums. Appalachian Kentucky is once risk rating 2.0 is fully implemented. So households are facing greater risks, but they have less financial protection to prepare when disasters hit. The second issue is in regards to displacement. So, as I mentioned before, there's very few buildable property in the Appalachian region of Kentucky. There's already been a sustained housing crisis in the region. Letcher County, where our organization is based, doesn't really have like hotels. And so there's not really like even temporary rental spaces that the state can engage with following certain flooding disasters that perhaps other states or other regions might be better suited for. That leads to population displacement, and we're already seeing a significant population decline in parts of East Kentucky and southern West Virginia, and repeat flooding disasters only exacerbates that issue, which in turn lowers tax bases, school enrollment, workforce availability, small business development. And so those issues compound year after year after year. And the third issue is that repeat disaster exposure. So the repeat flooding affects communities that have higher poverty rates. There's areas that have older or limited infrastructure. Local governments have been telling us for years that even before some of the more recent significant flooding disasters, people have to wear multiple hats in local government offices. Like they don't have someone who can pull down a lot of the necessary federal funds to help do this work. And so certain mitigation strategies, nature-based solutions like floodplain sinks, or similar projects that have taken place in places like Salt Lick or Moorhead in Kentucky, are really important critical investments that can significantly help rural parts of Kentucky. And so what this means, and we can go to the next slide, this equitable recovery system means that households, savings, their insurance, their time, all of this knowledge, that navigation is really important at the state level, at the local level. And we've been very fortunate to have been working with Rebuild by Design for a few years now, trying to take a lot of that, really relevant, helpful data and transform it into policy. And so Over the past few years, our Kentucky Flood Coalition, one lesson that we've learned is, Kentucky does not necessarily lack adequate data. The biggest challenge is finding ways to connect all this sort of disparate level of data and turn it into strategies for funding resilient infrastructure and creating more effective policy solutions. So things like combining exposure with levels of poverty, disability status, housing type, transportation access, insurance, capacity, all those things like intertwine. And it's helpful for us when we're speaking with lawmakers to show what areas of Kentucky are sort of at risk through these social vulnerabilities, as well as certain counties that may not have a full-time grant writing staff that can help pull down that federal funding. A lot of times, the things that tend to work best are the economic data, the ways that we can translate the helpful concerns from local communities about where disruptions in local revenue because of these disasters leads to ongoing issues that the state then has to take care of. Um, and we also want to make sure that, when we're talking with lawmakers, that they understand what does this return on investment look like, particularly for rural communities? How does a floodplain restoration project in one county affect downstream communities? How much property or infrastructure could this new project protect? What type of maintenance is required? What long-term funding strategies are needed? And so that capacity challenge really leads into the next slide, which is where Kentucky is currently focusing on financing resilience. So on the next slide, this is just sort of like a rough overview of where we're at in Kentucky. Um, by and large, a good chunk and sort of the main funding, the backbone, so to speak, comes from federal sources. It's going to come from FEMA following a major disaster declaration, helping with public infrastructure, mitigation, buyouts. You'll have housing and urban development for disaster recovery funding, and then Army Corps, USDA, and other agencies for watershed rehabilitation and other nature-based projects. But the problem that we're running up against is that all these different programs operate somewhat separately. There's not really like a good coordinating entity that allows the state and then the local governments to work amongst these different agencies and different funding streams and when that money is going to be available to ensure that the small communities that we work in have the adequate money and technical expertise to be able to make those projects go from idea to completion. Kentucky does have a program called the Flood Control Local Match Participation Program. This is really valuable. It provides local match funding for smaller communities to then use to pull down federal funds. The biggest challenge with that, though, is funding for that is relatively stable. I don't think it's increased. It wasn't increased in the last budget. And pretty much as soon as the money is in their office, it kind of goes out the door immediately. So there's not really a good rotating system. And so what that does is it makes it significantly harder for local communities to finance resilience projects without having a dedicated sort of state resilience fund that I know folks from North Carolina and West Virginia can talk about here in a minute. Um, so on the next slide, I think what's helpful, and I'll just kind of go over this sort of briefly, but um, it's helpful, I think, to kind of visualize what it looks like when you're experiencing a disaster of such magnitude like this for the first time, that the federal agencies, the federal funding programs that exist are meant to help that local capacity to help households that are affected by these disasters. And so this diagram sort of shows where Kentucky's strengths exist and also sort of our central weaknesses, where the state has a lot of really effective agencies like the Emergency Management Department, the Department for Local Government, for recovery and local match programs that help those local governments all throughout the Commonwealth. You have the Cabinet for Health and Family Services for disaster case management. The public universities just got this big NSF grant that's going to help with a lot of forecasting data, mapping research, and obviously our nonprofits that work with legal assistance, housing support, and so on. Um, but what that means is that if you're just a local official trying to help in the recovery process after a disaster, you're navigating a very complex web when in reality you're just trying to make sure that your community can kind of get back on its feet. And so this lack of a permanent state resilience office prevents Kentucky from having that sort of coordinated preparedness in the long run in the years leading up to a major flooding disaster as well as coordinating, following a disaster. Um, but on the next slide, this is just sort of a run through if anyone's interested in sort of the more recent history. So this just gives like a rough overview of Kentucky's climate disaster evolution over time. Um, the most sort of relevant aspect of this is noticing that in recent years there has been more of an attempt to focus on disaster resilience and climate resilience at the executive level, at the state level, more recently. The biggest benefit that I had seen in recent years was in 2025 following the session, there was this disaster prevention and resiliency task force that was set up for the interim period so that in 2026, when session started again, it was a budget year and we could make significant recommendations to the task force that would showcase here are all the different areas that Kentucky needs to focus on. Here are some helpful financing solutions that Rebuild by Design has been working on that we brought to lawmakers and we're really drumming the beat on. And on the next slide, this is where we got some of our coalition recommendations incorporated into the task force's recommendations. And this was where it was a really big win for us at the time because now we were taking this relatively new coalition. We had worked with Rebuild by Design for a few years. We were able to take all this data and helpful information and transform it into legislative recommendations that were incorporated into a whole suite of ideas for the General Assembly to consider. This is just a short list of some of the big recommendations that we worked on. Um, Unfortunately, though, despite our best efforts, despite the task force recommendations and all this work, these recommendations weren't incorporated. And so we're kind of going back now and realizing there's not a task force again in this interim period, but we want to make sure that the General Assembly is still aware of these issues and keeping up with these recommendations. So I'll finish with this last slide for folks who are interested. There are a bunch of different entities that exist and work kind of across this region. Kentucky doesn't have to do this work alone, and we don't do this work alone. We work collaboratively with a few different entities, whether they're funders like the Vulture New Climate Initiative, the Appalachian Flood Resilience Coalition that I'm on the steering committee for is federal policy advocacy and intersecting with state issues, but you also have groups like the Central Appalachian Network, as well as the Appalachian Disaster Resilience Network, which is more university-based and academic in focus. But all that to say, there's a lot of work that's taking place now. It's just a matter of coordination and continuing to make sure that those helpful data sets get turned into policy.
Thank you, Brendan. And just a reminder to everyone that's joining the webinar, feel free to drop any Q&A in the chat or in the Q&A function for the Q&A at the end of the call. Next, we're going to have Kristin Stroup from North Carolina. Welcome, Kristin.
Thanks, Olive, and hello, everybody. If we want to go to the first slide, I'm going to start off by telling you just a little bit about who Appalachian Voices is for those of you who aren't familiar. We've been around nearly 30 years. We got started in North Carolina in Boone, and we started out advocating for communities that were impacted by mountaintop coal mining, advocating for the land and air and water that these communities have always depended on. We are today a staff of about 46, I believe, and we have offices in 4 states, including North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. I am based in Black Mountain, North Carolina, so I'm one of the staff that work remotely. And our work continues to include empowerment of frontline communities, not only those impacted by coal mining, but also those on the front lines of climate change and our extractive economy in general. After Hurricane Helene and my experience here in Black Mountain, I started up a new area of programming for Appalachian Voices that is focused, as Olive said, on creating tools and resources and methods for education and empowerment around our climate risks and what adaptation and resilience could look like in our communities. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts that Hurricane Helene had almost 2 years ago, what we learned from it, and what some of the ongoing challenges and opportunities are as an outcome of that storm. So if we want to go to the next slide. Just a little bit about the why first. This is a picture of what used to be my mom's house, just about a mile down the road from me. And on the left, you can see the front of the house pre-Helene and the beautiful little bubbling brook that runs next to it. On the right is a still from a video that was shot during Helene when that stream and the debris flow behind the house turned into a raging river that surrounded the house. The person who was in the house at the time filmed that water. He failed to evacuate, and luckily, the house survived and he survived, but we should have all known better, and there were too many who were not so fortunate. And so the stories that I heard after Helene when I was volunteering up at the Emergency Operations Center and from friends, stories of friends washing down the river on their rooftops and landlines that did not perform and calls that were not received by first responders. That's what motivates the work that we do. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about why Helene was an unprecedented storm. It was a 1 in 1,000 year storm, which means it has a 0.1% chance of occurring. It does not mean that it'll be another 1,000 years before we have a storm like this. That is a common misconception. We here in Western North Carolina have experienced large flood events in the past. The Great Flood of 1916 was the first big one on record where we got over 22 inches of rain. The French Broad River rose to 23 feet in Asheville. The next second Great Flood occurred in 1940. Multi-day rainfall from a slow-moving hurricane resulted in similar impacts. Those were followed by more hurricanes and floods in 2004, 2021. 2021 was Hurricane Fred, where we saw severe flooding and mudslides in Canton, just west of Asheville, from 10 inches of rain. But what happened in Hurricane Helene 2 years ago was that we had multiple lifeline failures, and that is not something that we see every day. We lost power. Over 1 million customers lost power for many weeks. There were some communities that did not have power for months up in Yancey County. Over 400 roads and highways were destroyed as a result of landslides, flooding. We had a total loss of communications. That's cell phones. There was a total cell tower collapse across multiple counties. In Yancey County, over 90% of the cell towers were not functional after the storm. There were almost 2,000 miles of fiber optic cable that were destroyed by flooding. And for first responders, radio networks were overwhelmed. When local radio networks weren't, there were interoperability issues between counties. Floodplains don't respect county boundaries, so there was a need for a lot of coordination, which became difficult. So the statewide Viper network was used, and that quickly got overwhelmed. One of the first responders I spoke to described it as trying to merge 100 lanes of a highway into 5 lanes, and that's essentially what happened with our radio networks. And then, of course, as many people have heard, there was a famous total loss of water, the North Fork Reservoir, which is in Black Mountain, where I live. The emergency spillway was activated, which was, we were extremely fortunate that that investment was made 5 years ago. If it had not been installed to the reservoir, the flooding would have been much, much worse. But because that spillway was activated, the two main lines feeding Asheville and the Swannanoa Valley were destroyed. And so we were without water for 53 days. And that included both drinking water and gray water. And what that meant was we were going to creeks and swimming pools to get water to flush our toilets. So those are just some of the multiple lifeline failures that occurred. In addition to that, if we go to the next slide, we weren't dealing with just one hazard. We weren't just dealing with riverine flooding. We were also dealing with straight line winds and with landslides, and that's due to the topography of Western North Carolina, East Tennessee, and all of Appalachia. When we have the sort of rainfall that we had during Helene, which was up to 30 inches recorded at Mount Mitchell, that combines with the steep slopes that we have in the region and landslides develop. All across Appalachia, we have historical debris flow deposits, and those are areas where the risk of landslide is higher. In addition to riverine flooding, and I included here a table that shows the peak crest of some of the major rivers and how much higher they were than those earlier storms that I talked about. We also had the stormwater runoff. So even up, Mount Mitchell, where we got 30 inches of rain, the runoff of that water caused loosening of soil and mudslides, even where we didn't have historic debris flow deposits. Straight line winds and the fact that the winds were changing direction multiple times over created blowdowns that looked like basically tornado damage because the trees were basically falling in a crisscross pattern. In some counties, like McDowell County next door to where I am, over a quarter of the tree cover was lost. And across Western North Carolina, it was over 822,000 acres of timberland that was lost because of these straight line winds. So the compounded hazards that affected Western North Carolina also made response and recovery much harder with blocked roads, power lines down, and just entire rivers that were, the courses of the rivers were changed. Next slide will show the total estimated damage, which was almost $60 billion. As of today, a combination of federal, state, and philanthropic funding has covered not quite 30% of that, so we still have a long way to go. So, what did we learn? If we go to the next slide, there are a few key things that we as an organization and I as a human being learned from this disaster. Weather events affect all of us in one way or another, but we don't experience them in the same ways. What we learned is that the social determinants of health are also the social determinants of disaster. So distinctions of equity start to show up when we start to recognize the cascading failures that occur and the disproportionate impacts due to underlying vulnerabilities. And that's something that Brendan touched on very well in his presentation. Those who are already living on the margins of survival, for them, the impact can be catastrophic. And that is represented in the facts today, nearly 2 years later after Helene. We still have thousands of people who are displaced. There are roughly still 5,000 people waiting for the state's rebuilding program. Hundreds are still reliant on FEMA's housing and rental assistance and are living in temporary or RVs, or they're classified as unhoused. This is partly, as Brendan was touching on for Kentucky, due to the fact that less than 4% had flood insurance. And so when they lost their homes and their properties were no longer buildable, they had nowhere to go and nowhere to turn. And so that also meant that we saw people leaving the area entirely. And with people leaving, we've heard from counties and small towns that has affected their tax base and their ability to restore services. So it's a complicated issue. It also points to the fact that we need to be very careful to avoid displacement when we're rebuilding and revitalizing our downtowns as we put in parks, and greenways. We're driving up property values and we're making it even harder for those who were able to stay to remain. The other things that we learned is that despite all the data that we have, and North Carolina is a pretty data-rich state, we were grossly ignorant of our actual risks. And so we were not prepared. We weren't prepared to stay in place. We weren't prepared to evacuate, and we weren't prepared to respond. So if we go to the next slide, this is why adaptation and resilience are key. Climate change is a threat multiplier. That top graphic doesn't appear to be showing up, but it is a hot sun. Its impacts are not shared equally, and so we have to prepare in three different ways. One, we have to mitigate the speed of the Earth's warming, which is causing these increasingly catastrophic storms. Two, we need to adapt where we can to change our buildings and practices and environment to make them stronger, and to anticipate those risks. And then three, we need to strengthen our communities, and we need to do so in a holistic way that recognizes that resilience is not just about solar panels and batteries, or about packing go bags. So, next slide. For Appalachian Voices, our guiding beliefs and theory of change around resilience is that long-term resilience is built by people and communities. It doesn't come from the top down. It is built from the ground up, and it is built based on relationships and skills and knowledge and people coming together. This is what saved us after Helene, when we didn't have, I don't know if people are aware of this, but first responders make up 1.5% of the population, and they can't get to everybody. So when we do have a catastrophic storm like this, those mutual aid groups and our neighbors are the ones who are going to come help us figure out what to do, and bring the chainsaws and the bottled water. Resiliency is a community responsibility, and working together is required for us to be able to find a new way forward. I wanted to touch on the next slide, a couple of key challenges, and Brendan touched on some of these already. I apologize for the huge amount of data that's on this slide. But one of the things that is important to discuss and that we confront as a community is that adaptation isn't always possible. Recent flooding in Tennessee and Cott County has hit the same homeowners over and over. Their homes are getting flooded, and there's just not an easy solution to keeping them safe because they're in a floodway. So we have to be able to recognize when adaptation is not an option, and we need to look at other solutions. That's very difficult because we don't make buyout programs and relocation easy, and it's a tricky challenge that needs to be solved because as the severity of weather continues to increase, the need to move people out of harm's way is going to become more and more urgent. Another one I want to touch on is that data doesn't always exist and it's not always accurate. As I said, in North Carolina here, we are fortunate to have good data. We have, out of our state resilience office, which is in the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, we have a program called the Flood Resiliency Blueprint, and they are collecting advisory flood data, which goes down to a much more granular level than the FEMA regulatory flood data. So we are able to look at areas that are at high risk of nuisance flooding and more frequent flooding and make plans to keep people in those areas and businesses in those areas safe. Landslide data is something that the Department of Environmental Quality has been collecting for years. While they got interrupted in that process in Western North Carolina for a couple of years due to policy changes and political decisions, they are back on top of collecting that data. And so we have really good understanding of where landslide risk is. Unfortunately, that data was not adequately communicated to residents in those areas, in all of those areas. Some were aware. So we need to do a better job of collecting and disseminating data in a way that's easily understandable. Another thing I want to touch on is that, and Brendan mentioned this as well, warning systems are inadequate. We saw that in the Texas Hill Country. We continue to see it over and over. It is exacerbated in places like Northeast Tennessee, where we have former coal camp communities with very spotty cell service. And now this year, AT&T and other cell companies, landline companies, are removing the landlines. And so their ability to communicate is going to become even harder. In those areas, we need to think creatively and look at grassroots solutions for monitoring and warning so that these communities are not dependent on the counties finding the money to put in proper stream gauge monitors and other systems that are extremely expensive and beyond the investment capacity of a lot of local governments. The last thing I'd like to touch on here is that in North Carolina, we have, out of our resilience office, very good plans. There are a lot of toolkits and plans available to communities and residents, but there's a disconnect between those plans and on-the-ground implementation. Partly, I think this is because these plans are big documents and it's just overwhelming. It's much easier to break off little chunks and introduce things in manageable quantities. Than to present with a large plan. There's also a challenge with funding from implementation trickling down from the state level to the local level. There are a lot of local governments that just don't have the capacity to write grant applications and do all of the modeling and analysis that's required to get those funds. I also want to touch on policy challenges. Brendan mentioned a few of those, but I think it's important for us as regular citizens to advocate. We need to get out and vote, but we also need to advocate for things like the FEMA Act to fund and adequately staff FEMA and remove some of the barriers and inefficiencies that we've seen under the current administration. And we also need to fund the BRIC grant opportunity, the Building Resilience and Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. Which was recently refunded for, I believe, 3 years, but that's not going to last very long. So finally, on this next slide, I just want to talk about a few of the things we are doing here at Appalachian Voices. We are really working from the household level up to build resilient and connected communities. I want to recognize that some of our most exciting work that we've started last year and are ramping up this year is thanks to a collaboration with Rebuild by Design and the Local Initiative Support Corporation, a CDFI. Together, they launched a national cohort called the Local Resilience Action Network. Appalachian Voices was fortunate to be a member of that cohort. And some of the work that we did was we started a Prepare in a Year series with a community health forum in Old Fort, McDowell County, where every month we sit with the community and we look at one aspect of preparedness, like wildfire risk. And we create binders that have checklists and resources for people to take home. So in a pinch, they can look back and remind themselves of what they need to do. We're also part of a state-funded program that is placing solar and battery microgrids on resilience hubs and fire stations so that we have that redundancy of power supply for both power and communications. And then we are also in Swannanoa working with the community to develop a community emergency response plan for unincorporated communities. This is extremely important so that they have a process already in place for who's going to do what in the event of a disaster. And finally, we are creating tools and resources to facilitate access to climate risk data for households and looking at parcel level risks. This is something that there is a big gap in currently across the country for people to better understand what they need to do to keep themselves safe. And part of that includes household resilience audits. I am going to stop here because I know that I've gone past my time and I want to make sure that we have enough time for Carrie's presentation. So thank you all and happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Kristen. And we're going to pass it over to Carrie. We have about 10 minutes left of the webinar, but if you would like to stick around 5 or 10 minutes after for any Q&A, I see some that are coming in the chat. Feel free. We'll be here. Thank you. Over to you, Carrie.
Thanks, Olive. Johanna, I'm going to share my screen. If possible. Thank you. Right. So I have the unique opportunity to go after both Brendan and Kristen, who have had amazing presentations, and we have a lot of the similar stories to tell about our experience with flooding in our states and in Appalachia. My name is Carrie Decker. I'm with West Virginia Rivers Coalition. I'm the Community Engagement Manager, and I've been working with the wonderful team at Rebuild by Design for a little over a year now on flood resiliency and mitigation. West Virginia Rivers Coalition is 35 years young, started with paddlers and clean water for recreation. And now we have many campaigns around clean and safe drinking water, recreation. We support watershed organizations across the state. We're doing work around data center, water transparency, public lands conservation, petrochemicals, and obviously flood resiliency and mitigation. So I'll just start my presentation with this picture, which was from 2016 flooding that we had. And this was in White Sulphur Springs. This is Kim Green's home. And during the 2016 flooding, we saw devastation like never before. And this was a house on fire going down the neighborhood. And I created this presentation before our most recent flooding. And so we definitely have our neighbors in Upshur and Lewis County in our thoughts. They just experienced really terrible flooding 2 weeks ago. And as both Brendan and Kristin mentioned, this is becoming more and more the norm for our communities. So in West Virginia, we see a lot of neighbors helping neighbors. We've coined the term West Virginia Strong. These were pictures of photos that were rescued from one of the homes in White Sulphur Springs. But as you can see, there's lots of reasons for neighbors to help neighbors with memories and mucking out homes, and just generally helping in a disaster. West Virginia is uniquely susceptible to flooding because of our mountainous terrain. We have steep slopes, we have highly erodible soil. Our infrastructure is mainly built in the river valleys because that's where our flat land is. We have lots of waterways in the state and nowhere for water to go. And so when we have this torrential downpour, our water goes directly into those river valleys where we have our infrastructure. And this map is one of the excellent data points that we've worked with Rebuild on, and this is the FEMA 100-year floodplain. These are all of the places in West Virginia, and you can see how much of the state is in the floodplain. So we're uniquely susceptible to these floods and taking out really important infrastructure because of the way that our topography is and then the way that our towns and communities are built. In West Virginia, 45 of our 55 counties are above the national flood, the 90th percentile for the national flood. So we have a lot of risk. And compounding all of those floodplains is our social vulnerability in the state. So the social vulnerability index is taken with items like how much of the population is below the poverty line or unemployed, the completed degree of education, how many neighborhoods or how many clusters of mobile homes there may be, the elderly population of the county, how many single parent households there are, if there are disabled households, and then also if homes and households don't have vehicle access. So as you can see, a lot of the state is not only vulnerable in the floodplains, but also socially vulnerable. And as Kristin and Brendan mentioned, this leaves us even more in a tough spot when we have these disasters. Research studies on climate change show that as we rely on fossil fuels, we contribute more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which changes our weather patterns. It changes the jet streams, it warms the oceans, and that means more extreme weather. So we're seeing more and more of these flooding events. We have an atmospheric river that we experience now where it just drops an enormous amount of rainfall over a short period of time, and we continue to experience that more often. When we look at all of these compounding factors, we keep pushing for nature-based solutions. So if a watershed is healthy, the floodwaters that come into the watershed are able to be absorbed. So we think upstream for flood mitigation. We find a place for the water to go. We want to we want the landscape to absorb the water, store it, and slowly release it instead of just letting it pour right into our communities and our river valleys. With parking lots and developments, we fill in wetlands. And so we really need to look for green infrastructure, rain gardens, bioswales, and reconnecting the river floodplains. We have Piney Creek Watershed in Beckley. They're doing some amazing rain garden work. Plateau Action Network has rain gardens they're working on at local schools. And in the Eastern Panhandle, we have Berkeley Springs. They have a fantastic rainwater management program. So all of these are nature-based solutions that are helping our communities deal with the disasters and the increase in the flooding that we're seeing. So this is an intricate timeline that our amazing policy specialist Maria put together for us. I'm just going to highlight a few things. So in 2016, we had the historic floods. We lost too many lives, displaced a lot of people. We had a lot disaster declarations and over $1 billion in damages. After those historic floods, we had House Bill 2935, where the House acknowledged the floods and they established the State Resiliency Office. Now that office has been moved around in our state government. And then in 2023, our Senate Bill 677 amended that Flood Protection Plan Act to include the Flood Resiliency Trust Fund. It was not funded, but it does require that at least 50% of the trust fund disbursement benefit low income area, and at least 50% goes towards nature-based solutions. Now, again, that was not funded from 2016 up until actually this current legislature in 2026, where we had $5 million put into the Flood Resiliency Trust Fund from surplus money. And so it's a good start, but we definitely need more. This is an interactive website where you can get information on flooding, disaster declarations, and other important information about West Virginia flooding to inform communities. Like Brendan and Kristin have mentioned, we're very lucky that we have fantastic universities in the state, and we are lucky to partner with a lot of the researchers, and we are grateful of all of the work that they're doing around flooding in the state so that we can inform communities and continue to advocate for better solutions. So as we've all noted, there's been some progress in the last 10 years, but there's still more work to do. There's no mention of green infrastructure or nature-based solutions in our West Virginia Flood Resiliency Plan. So this is an opportunity to educate on how nature-based solutions can help to prevent and mitigate flooding. And here's a screen grab from our state resiliency office. This was the office that was originally established in 2017. So nearly 10 years later, and there are no projects listed. So this leaves room for us to offer projects that will give our environment space to absorb floodwater before impacting our communities, and really suggesting projects that will help our communities deal with these disasters. So we invite you to get involved with us. Our website is listed. You can sign up for our emails or follow us on socials. We advocate at the Capitol, both state and federally, to work on funding that trust fund. We advocate for very specific projects around the state. So we would love to have you sign up and be involved.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And I want to thank for everyone that participated. Want to thank all of our partners, West Virginia Rivers,